Hi guys, I want to talk to you today about the differences between the wrestling business in 1999, 1998, 1997, and of course where we are today in 2016. Um, this is probably going to be part of a series of different different sound videos, and I'm going to discuss um, my different opinions on what made the business successful in the 90s, the late 90s, and why it's still extremely successful today, just in a different way. Now, the first thing that we have to lay a foundation about is that we have to agree, at least as wrestling fans, that if we were to sit down and watch a wrestling show from 1999, 1998, compared to a show that we would watch today, 2016, that we would be more interested in watching a show from 1999 than a show from 2016. Now, anybody can argue, well, I would be just as interested in watching a show today as I would be in the year 1999. They're just as interesting, they're just as popular. I want to put that theory to the test. I want you to actually go back and watch a show from 1999 and then compare it to a show from 2016. Now, as a wrestling fan from today compared to in 1999, you would probably watch the show and it is interesting to you in the moment because these shows are just took place not too long ago. So it might be a refresh or a reminder of the current situation in wrestling today. But if you go back and I would, rarely ever do this. I'm not going to watch a show from 2013. I'm not going to watch a show from 2014. I might watch some matches. There was always good matches. Some of my favorite matches from 2014: Bray Wyatt versus Daniel Bryan, The Shield versus the Wyatts. You can go back and pick and choose these matches that you would probably watch. Evolution versus The Shield, etc., etc. There were good matches, and you would probably sit there and say, okay, well, I can watch this match. I even enjoyed the Randy Orton John Cena match, Royal Rumble 2014, just for the simple fact that the finish was really cool, and also the crowd reaction was let's just say it was interesting. My point is that I can sit here and legitimately watch a show from 1998, 1999, knowing the results, knowing the wrestlers that are going into it, knowing the characters, and still enjoy and watch the show as a fan. Not as a wrestling fan, mind you, not as a fan of what's going on in the product, but just as a casual viewer who just happens to enjoy or like wrestling. So not someone who is a fan of the business, who enjoys the wrestling product. Just someone who casually might want to check this out. And if I were to if I were to want someone to watch wrestling nowadays, I would pop in on a pay-per-view from 1999 and say this is what wrestling is, rather than pop in a show from 2016, because personally I would feel like it would just it would capture the person's imagination, and they would be more inclined to watch wrestling based upon that rather than based upon something I would show them from the current period of time, from the current product. So basically, this first show, I'm going to go ahead and analyze something that's very, very important. And like I said before, we need to lay down a basic fundamental understanding, okay? If we do not accept that 1999 wrestling is better than 2016 wrestling, then this conversation and this recording really doesn't matter to you, because to me it is obvious that the wrestling in 1999 was better. It is obvious. As you know, there are other things we can compare wrestling to, such as Star Wars. I grew up with the new Star Wars, the new generation, and you could always say that the old Star Wars movies were better. I grew up with the new Star Wars movies, so there is much more of a conversation in the sense of I can argue that some of the new movies have better parts or better sequences, you would say, than the old movies. Obviously, the graphics in the new movies are a lot better. But most, if not all, Star Wars fans would agree that the old Star Wars movies are just better. Better writing, better acting, better actors, more innovation. They were innovative for their time period. While the new Star Wars movies were good, they were really, some of them were. I enjoyed Revenge of the Sith, but the story was just it was almost like filler, like trying to fill this gap between what occurred between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader, which was Anakin Skywalker, and trying to fill in that gap of what occurred in these movies that came along afterwards in the sequence, not necessarily whenever they were actually on in movie theaters. But when comparing something that's just better than something else, we have to lay down like, for instance, this is my point. If we were to compare Batman and Robin compared to The Dark Knight, I don't think that there is one person that would, and I granted that they're two different genres. Batman and Robin was more comedic, and The Dark Knight was more film noir. But I would argue to say that there isn't one person on planet Earth that would actually believe that Batman and Robin was a better film than that of The Dark Knight. I don't that it's almost impossible for anybody to disagree with that point, and that's what we have to agree on to a certain degree. You could say that there are positives about Batman and Robin. You can say, well, it was funny, and I like some of the acting, and some of the and maybe the costumes were nice, but we can't sit here and listen. Everyone has a different preference in what they like and what they enjoy. But gold, if we cannot agree that gold is better than feces, then we will never be able to progress as casual as viewers of this product. We as viewers need to, and not just us, but wrestling won't be able to progress because us as viewers, we sit here and we'll watch the show and we will just enjoy it for the show and not say, well, because I feel like it's almost a responsibility for us wrestling fans, the ones that are actual wrestling fans, to kind of put in our 2 cents, because a lot of these people, they just don't really understand what casual wrestling fans and just fans of entertainment are looking for nowadays. I want to be able to go out and tell people I'm a wrestling fan. And granted, there's still a lot of people that enjoy the product, but I feel like it's not part of pop culture the way it used to be. And now, of course, pop culture is a lot different today than it was in the 90s. We have internet, and internet's probably the biggest thing in the United States of America. It's everybody uses every social media obviously is extremely is at a different level than it was back then, and wrestling is always going to be popular in that sense, but the fact of the matter is it's not a subject that you can speak about to everyone, because not everyone will be able to understand. Might be a good portion of people that will actually be able to communicate and talk wrestling, and then there will be a large percentage of people that just won't be able to understand. And more importantly, they'll just look down on you because you are a wrestling fan. I want to. This first video, I want to. That's just the first part. I want to get through is the fact that we have to agree that something is better than something else. Okay. it's almost like the argument, which one is better, $1 million or $1,000? Which one is better? And we can go back and forth and argue, well, $1,000 is better for this reason and $1 million is better for that reason. But if we can't agree that having $1 million is better than having $1,000, if we can't have a common understanding, a common ground that we can both walk upon, then the conversation will end at that point, and there will be no reason for us to continue to analyze the situation. We have to have a common ground. Okay, the wrestling was better back then. The action was better back then. Okay, the storylines were better back then. The characters were better back then. The finishes to matches got everybody involved over. Everybody involved. The commentary was better. Okay, the structures of the shows were positioned better. The puzzle pieces were in the right place. The atmosphere of the show was a lot more was edgier, and a 18 to 35 demographic wrestling fan would be able to would be able to watch the show and relate to it, rather than nowadays where it's not as relatable, at least not to the casual 18 to 35 fan. I feel like now it's a lot more about, futuristic. It kind of has like a futuristic look, but to me it just looks kind of stale, boring. It just has a boring look to it, a boring kind of atmosphere. There's not much going on. There's not an edgy. There's not an edginess. Of course, we live in the year 2016, 1999, and the 90s was a lot more about rebellion. While the 2000s is a lot more about pride. But I feel like just because we live in a different time period, that doesn't mean that your product has to suffer for it. So I think that that's the first part. I want to make that perfectly clear, is that we have to make a common understanding that nowadays wrestling just isn't as good. And if you'd like to argue these points, then feel free to comment and argue these points. I'll try to make some sort of response, something, ask questions, and we'll be able to have a conversation about this, because I feel like it's very, very important for us as wrestling fans to give our opinions, because these guys, they watch the show, they're making these shows, and they watch these shows, and they just they take it at face value, when they should probably have a bigger, a much larger audience and more of a following, because it's something that needs to be around. Wrestling needs to be around. It's a way for people to be able to kind of suspend disbelief in an environment where that probably isn't really. It's something that isn't as prevalent as it used to be, maybe in the old days, in past times. So we don't have, people don't go to plays as much anymore. It's a way for Americans, normal Americans, to kind of free themselves from the everyday monotony. So I'm gonna go ahead and analyze this this particular video. I want to talk about okay. So basically, it goes like this. Okay. One of the things that people argue nowadays is that the reason that wrestling is still successful, and that ratings, and that basically, like, it's as successful as it can be. That the reality of the situation is, because, okay, I want to establish this. I feel like the most besides all of the other things that were better in the 90s, I feel like one of the worst parts of the wrestling product today is the storyline. Okay, now let me try to explain what I mean by storyline. Okay, I don't necessarily mean just what's going on the show. I mean the entire setup. Okay, a storyline should not just be an angle that happens and then we get to the next match. Okay. Maybe in the early 90s that was possible, but by the late 90s, the wrestling product had changed. So I don't believe that. So storyline is a combination of all the different things. What is going on during the match? What is going on after the match? What happened before the match? The characters involved in the match, as well as the angles and the situations that happened before and after these matches. So it's a combination of all these different things, the in-ring segments, backstage segments, segments that go on in the arena. It's a combination of all those things, okay? At that period of time, the Attitude Era was a storyline. The entire product felt like it was in this storyline. It wasn't this guy is fighting this guy and they're in a storyline. It was like the product, the Attitude Era, the Monday Night Raw was a storyline. Everything kind of went together. All of the different people, all the different parts, all kind of strung together in one way or the other. Okay, I would venture to say that they probably took ECW's example and molded it into their product, because ECW was kind of the same in the sense of ECW in and of itself was the storyline. The entire product was the storyline. What I mean by that is everybody was involved with everybody. There was connecting storylines. Everybody was in a feud with someone else. They all had backstory and history, and they all had interesting characters that changed and built and moved around depending on where they were and who they were fighting and the situation they were in. Okay. Nowadays, it's very different because you have one guy or one team fighting another guy or another team, and as long as they're involved in the storyline, nothing of their past or what they went through, even the storyline before, doesn't get brought up. So there's no continuity in that sense. You don't have a feeling of we're connecting this to this. Look at how Dean Ambrose and Chris Jericho have been feuding lately, and we still haven't had, at least not. Maybe they've done it in a backstage fallout or on the online or something, but they still haven't addressed the fact that Chris Jericho, was shoved Dean Ambrose a few months ago when they were in the match between the Wyatts and the remaining Shield members of Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns and Chris Jericho. They still haven't addressed that. And, maybe they have. I'm not sure. I can't, I don't watch it as religiously as I used to, so I can't sit here and say that it happened, but I don't, they haven't addressed that when it should have been something that should have been addressed right off the bat, is that these two guys had an issue, and that, maybe commentary might have, mentioned it or said something, but it's not, it should have been something that should have been totally addressed by now, and it should have been something that should be the focal point of this situation, is Chris Jericho saying, Dean Ambrose, it's your fault, you lost against this guy, you lost against this guy, it's you cost me, an opportunity, and because of this and this and that. They should run with the situations and the moments that have occurred in the past, and they just don't do it. So I just want to analyze and this is the reason that I'm saying it, okay? If you were to go back and look at the roster that existed in 1997, 1996, 1995, 1994 of the WWF, and you were compare it to the roster that existed in the WWF in 1999, you would see that, or it's quite obvious that most, if not all, of the talent that existed in that period of time existed in 1999. Now, to many, to some people that might not matter, but to me, I think it's a very important. I feel like that's a very good point when arguing that it's not necessarily the wrestlers, it's not necessarily what the wrestlers are doing, it's creative. It's what creative does. And that's the reason that I'm trying to make this video, is because I want people to understand that it is creative that is kind of the biggest part of, or the biggest reason that wrestling just isn't as, well, listen, there are a lot of different components. I feel like maybe, I feel like the production team of WWE is incredible, but I feel like the look of the show might have to be altered a little bit and changed, maybe bring it up to 2016. Even though they have changed the show quite a bit, but it just doesn't have that same impact, and pardon the pun, impact that it would have. That the 90s and even the early 2000 look of the show kind of had, in terms of people being, in terms of casual wrestling fans actually watching the show and enjoying it, and it being a part of pop culture. So, now that I've basically established that point, because that's my, my theory is that it's creative. Creative is probably the most disastrous as well as the most important part of a wrestling show, because it is a show, my friends. It is on Monday Night Raw. Monday Night Raw is a TV show, okay? It has, they have sponsors, and it's a 3-hour show on a cable network. Okay, so it is a TV show. You need good writing. Okay, so let me go ahead and read off the roster that existed in the late to well, I would say from the 95, 96, etc. Okay, so here's some of the names that existed. All right, give me one moment. If you can give me one moment, I want to go ahead and I'm going to read off the rosters that existed in 95, 96, 97, 98, compare them to the ones in 1999, and then I'm going to give you a little more backstory and try to sit here and analyze a little bit more of why I'm saying it, and etc. etc. Okay. Now, first off, there are a few names that were included in the late 90s that hadn't existed before. Okay, some of these stars included in this particular situation were Edge, Christian, Gangrel, The Brood. They were all new stars in that 98, 99. Although Edge, as Sexton Hardcastle, or that other the character he did as in WCW, he was in WCW for a little while. Gangrel, who was in ECW, and Christian, who was probably working, independence at that period of time, and probably trying to get into the WWF as well. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading off some of these names. The other guys that weren't there, that debuted afterwards, were guys like Shamrock, Steve Blackman, Val Venus. There were a few names that that debuted in 1998, 1999, and weren't in the WWF before. There were a few, and when I say a few, I mean literally a few, like almost not like. So let me go ahead and read some of the names that existed in the WWF in 1996. Okay, 1995. All right. Some of these names include Bret Hart, Undertaker. You have 1-2-3 Kid. You have Bob Holly. You have Billy Gunn. You have Bart Gunn. You have Jeff Jarrett, Goldust. So we have Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who had debuted in 1995. Okay, so besides that, you also had Isaac Yankem, DDS. You had Undertaker. You had Mankind, debuted in 1996. You had, of course, like I said, Stone Cold Steve Austin, debuted in 1995, late 1995, early 1996. You had Rocky Maivia, debut in 1996. Now, if we were to sit here and see the ratings of these shows in 1996, so this is when a lot of these guys were already here. This is a time period where most of these guys were already on the show. So, alright, here's 1996. So, Survivor Series happened, I'll just go ahead and say the early 1997, okay? The rating for January 6th, 1997 was a 2.1, okay? Let me go ahead and repeat that, okay? So the rating for WWF okay, for January 6, 1997 was a 2.1. A 2.1, okay? This included Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels was there, Stone Cold Steve Austin was there, Hunter Hearst Helmsley was there, still not Triple H, still not the full Triple H that he had become. Rocky Maivia was there, Undertaker was there. Kane still hadn't debuted. He was in the WWF before as Isaac Yankem DDS, okay? So all of these names existed within the structure of the wrestling business in 1997, January 6th. Each and every one of these guys was in the wrestling business, okay? The rating of the show was a 2.1, all right? Now, all the stars that came before them, and like I said, I could read off most of them, okay? You have, like, Midian, okay, was there. Viscera was there. Godfather was there. All of these names had been in the business and had been in WWF even before 1996, you know. They might have been different, you know, like Mabel, you know, Viscera was Mabel, and Godfather was you know, the you know, the Street Fighter or whatever, and before that he was Papa Shango, of course. But these guys had been in the business and had been in the WWF for years. Jeff Jarrett is another name. Owen Hart, you know. The list goes on of all these guys that made it, that were all in the business, in, you know, even guys like Al Snow was in the WWF in you know, 96, 90, you know, in 90, 95, 96. So, and if you analyze and you sit here and you watch and you read off these ratings of January 6, 1997 compared to, now let's go to the ratings of January 6, 1999. Okay? The rating now of January 4th, 1999 was a 5.7. Okay? So basically, okay, what that means is you could, I mean, it's close to 6.2, and they actually reached 6.3 in March 1st, 1999. So we are talking about tripling their audience in the course of 2 years. In the course of 2 years, this show went from a 2.1 to a 6.3. So in the course of 2 years, with the same roster that they had for years, because their roster was not that different. Besides some of the introductions of new guys, okay, the debut of Kane, the character, the changing of Mankind, the changing of Rocky Maivia to The Rock, the changing of Stone Cold Steve Austin, the growth of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Because in 97 he was Stone Cold Steve Austin, but the growth of the character, the development. Undertaker changing the character, becoming more realistic. But understand that everything that I am saying that had made the product better was all creative. It was all based around creative being better, and, you know, having these characters that existed in WWF since the 90s, since 95, 96, 97, 94, since the early 90s, or excuse me, mid 90s to late 90s, and using each and every character to their full potential. For instance, D'Lo Brown went from being a member of the Nation of Domination as a backup guy with a suit to being in the Nation, you know, as a competitor wearing his the chest protector and winning European championships, being a part of the show, having his own gimmick, his own look, his own finish, his own kind of way in the product. And, you know, this was included in many guys. Look at what 1-2-3 Kid became. You know, he grew the beard. Of course, a part of that was the fact that he went to WCW and, you know, his character developed and changed there. But the WWF, you know, took these guys, you know, that none of them were really successful. I mean, let's sit here and analyze, okay? In 95, none of these guys would have been able to draw flies to a feces house, okay? None of these guys would have been able to draw any, like, a large amount of money, okay? Hunter Hearst Helmsley, the 1-2-3 Kid. You had the real Jesse James, or at the time he was the Roadie, okay? And Billy Gunn, part of the Smoking Guns. if you were to sit here and tell me in 1985 that these four guys were going to revolutionize the wrestling business, I would think that you were probably smoking something that you probably shouldn't be smoking. Okay, so what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, these four guys. Okay, nobody would have ever expected these guys to be a mainstay or a main draw in the wrestling business, and yet these four guys are the members of D Generation X, which was one of the most successful things in wrestling even today. Was probably one of the biggest parts of the Attitude Era, and even today, one of the biggest parts of wrestling in general. And that's basically my point: is that the it's not the wrestlers, it's not what the wrestlers are doing right or what they're doing wrong. I don't like it where a lot of these guys that are in the business and just guys in general that watch the product, they blame the wrestlers for not being better than what they are, when it is obvious that it's because creative is not giving them the right, the right way, the right information. They're not giving them gold, they're giving them shit. And they want them to be successful, but they give them feces, and they expect them to make feces into something that, they expect the writers and the management expect these wrestlers to be the best that they can be in an environment where that's just not possible, where they don't write good enough material for them. Okay? And this is why I make this comparison. So basically what I'm trying to say, to sum this all up, okay, is most of the Attitude Era stars that were successful all existed in the mid to late 90s. Where at a time where the wrestling product was not as good, the ratings were not as great, there was not nearly the amount of money coming into the wrestling business, and in general the product was lame. It was stale, okay? So, and the reason that okay, so that's the first thing that we have to go ahead and kind of understand. And the second part of this is that the reason that these guys were successful wasn't because of anything that they did. Most of them wrestled the same way. I mean, granted, maybe some of them might have changed a little bit here and there. They might have got a little tougher, and the attitude might have changed. But what made them successful was the fact that they were in an environment where that was possible. They had someone there, in whether you like him or you don't, someone like Vince Russo, someone like that, or like, Ed Ferrara, who came around and weren't afraid to just write what they felt was the right way. Felt like, and had other guys, but they were in an environment where that was a possibility. They had good material, good stories that they could work on, and and they were able to build their own character the way that they felt it should be, rather than the way that management saw them. And I feel like that's something that just isn't done today. It's a lot more. It's not the fact that it's more contrived or less contrived. It's the fact that the creative just isn't as good. It's just not. So basically, if you sit here and you analyze this, and you say most of the guys that were successful in the Attitude Era already had jobs in the WWF and were already and a lot of them were already at the top. I mean, many of them were. Some of them had to come in. But I feel like DX is a perfect example of that. Is the fact of the matter is, the reason that these people were successful was that they were allowed to create their own characters. They were given good stories, okay? They were, and more importantly than all that, is that, they gave them a reason to be there. And nowadays, it's just not the same. You can have someone on the show wrestling a 20-minute match that doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. So basically, my point, and this should pretty much show you that that the reality of the situation is, it's not the wrestlers, it's the writing. It's the creative. It's someone sitting back there and saying, we need to change the way we look at things. And that's the reason that the product changed. Okay? And if anybody were to say, if anybody tells you no, it's the wrestlers and the wrestlers, it's the wrestling, it's the fact that somebody that they're not doing enough. All I have to do is point out four names: Billy Gunn, 1-2-3 Kid, the Roadie, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley. And if you point out those four guys and you tell me how these four guys in '95 probably wouldn't even have had a pop in the audience. None of them were and in 1999, each and every one of those guys were not only successful individually, but were mega stars collectively. So what I'm trying to say is, which 99 Triple H became world champion. And of course there's a progression in wrestling where a guy starts out down here and then he goes up there. But if a person is not given the opportunity to succeed and is not given the right material, then they're never going to be able to transcend, transcend and become megastars in this environment. They're just not. So this should go out to show you guys that it isn't the wrestlers, and that creative is good, but it can be better. Okay? Back then, there were puzzle pieces scattered everywhere. Okay, let me read the rating one more time so people can understand. 97, the rating in January was a 2.1. The rating in January was a 5.7. They got till 6.3 in March. Triple the rating. That means 3 times as many people watched the show in 99 than they did in 97. 3 times. Okay? You can't fabricate that. That isn't something that you can just... It's real. It's called putting the pieces in the right place, allowing people to create their own characters, and putting these people in good stories and making the product better in every single way. It's about improving from the top to the bottom, and that's what they did. Everybody mattered. Everybody had a story, and everybody was important, whether they were in their own lane or they were going back and forth up and down the ladder. Each and every person mattered. And that's something that just doesn't happen today. Not everyone matters. Most of the people don't matter. Look at how Zack Ryder goes and becomes Intercontinental Champion, and then the next night he loses the belt. And you could argue to say, yeah, I mean, he's going to be involved in the Intercontinental title match, but who was Zack Ryder before he won the match? Before he won that match, he beat Chris Jericho a few weeks before that. He rolled him up and beat him because of an interference by AJ Styles and all that. And Zack Ryder won a good match against a world champion. That's awesome. But regardless of that, where is Zack Ryder now? I mean, and more importantly, where was he before? They didn't write a good enough story for this guy. Based on an injury that happened to Neville. Now, Neville, has an injury, so we get the Zack Ryder story, and we're going to make him, win the Intercontinental title because of the feel-good moment of him, and the fact that, he had a picture with Scott Hall with the Intercontinental belt, and they wanted to almost relive that in the fact that now Zack Ryder has the Intercontinental Championship, and he's standing next to Scott Hall. Great moment in general, but what is that going to matter in the long run? And what is it going to matter to the product in and of itself? Every situation and every moment should matter to somebody for some reason. And they should be more interested in making the product better and not just having feel-good moments, And it's nothing against Zack Ryder. It's just that they don't use him enough or do enough with him in order for him to be anything more than what he is right now, which is a contender for the Intercontinental belt, which he isn't even the number one contender. Cesaro is. So... Guys, what I'm trying to say is a very simple, basic point, and I need people to understand this. So again, we have to have a common understanding. If you guys are going to listen, that's fine. If you're going to comment and give your piece, that's fine. We have to have a common understanding that wrestling today just isn't as it's just it's not as popular. That's obvious, in terms of the casual wrestling fan. Do you have probably a lot more people watching? Well, I mean, you have a lot more people alive now than you did in 1999, but more, and I mean, it's a global company because it's traded publicly, but just because all these different factors go into it, they have a large subscription, a large amount of people that actually subscribe to the network and everything. Regardless of all that, guys, back then people were getting paid more than they are today. Okay, if you had 1 million people watching your pay-per-view back then, okay, which they probably garnered at least 1 million viewers for every pay-per-view. So let's say 1 million people watched this pay-per-view and paid $40-$50 for the pay-per-view. Then that was a gross income of $40 million. Okay, compared to nowadays, if someone has a $10 for the a month for the subscription, yeah, and there's 1.9 2 million people that are paying $10 a month, then yeah, they're gonna get a good $20 million. That not included the funds that they have to pay for the network and everything, and of course because of but that's not even included the revenue that they made when it came to obviously product placement, etc., etc. Obviously, back then they were getting paid a lot more because it was pay-per-view than they are on a network subscription model. So obviously they were making a lot more money back then, guys. And so in terms of popularity, it was a lot more popular. In terms of interesting storylines and interesting characters, it was a lot more interesting back then. If we can agree on those points and agree now that you see that it isn't about what kind of wrestlers you have, okay? Most of the wrestlers that existed in 99 were there in 95, 96, 97. So it's not about the wrestlers. It's about the way you use them. And it's about the stories and the characters. And that's what it's about. It's not about the wrestling. It's never been. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you next time.